Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me and welcome to the webinar. So this is a PSE and Ubitricity webinar. And the theme of this is all around EV charging infrastructure and the decisions made to try and place the right charger, the right location, the right time. So right charger, right place, right time. I think is a subject that we all grapple with. And we've got a great panel of speakers. And the idea is to have a conversation about this, to get your thoughts. We really want participation from all of you. You can ask your questions there's a little link below called Ask Your Question in the interface. So if you can do that, we'd really like it to be as interactive as possible. But thank you very much, everybody, for giving up your time today. We got a really long list of attendees, so that's fantastic. It's obviously a topic that is close to all of your interests. Now, just to dig into the theme of this before we then move on to introduce the panelists, I think that this question of what sort of charging infrastructure do you put in what location and when do you do that is something we all grapple with. It sounds simple, but when you think of the huge scale of depending your personal view, the data you use, what you believe, anything from 300 to 700,000 public charge points need to be deployed by 2030 to enable the ramp up of EVs and the phase out of the sales of diesel and petrol vehicles. It's an enormous challenge. And I would say almost the group of people closest to that challenge are the local authorities and the people in those local authorities that have to do the planning and the decisions. And really, that's what we want to address is what are the dilemmas? What are the questions? What are all of the things that need to be considered? How can this be done in an efficient way, but in a way that is fair, that is at the right speed, and I suppose crucially that enables what we all want from this EV transition, which is cleaner air, lower CO2 emissions, and to meet the sustainability and the climate targets of local authorities across the country, and to clean up our transport. So I think we all have the same aim. It's just tackling these questions of how do we actually do it. So without any any further discussion from myself, just quick overview of how we're going to run this. We're going to have around 40 minutes of discussion between the panelists. But like I said, you can use the Ask Your Question to inject your own thoughts, ideas, questions as we go. And we might pick up a few of those as we go along, but also we'll leave 15 minutes at the end. And that's where we will pick out as many questions as we can. And the questions we can't get to, we'll try to answer afterwards. So like I say, please ask your questions throughout. But now let's go on and let's meet our panelists. And I'll get them to introduce themselves, but very quickly. So we have Femi from London Councils. We have Femi BB from London Councils. We have Daniel Gosby from Waltham Forest, the London Borough of Waltham Forest. And we have Mark Cooper from Ubitricity. And we have, and myself, who's hosting or chairing this, I'm Toby Butler, the managing director from Ubitricity in the UK. But maybe quick a couple of words from each of them, just introducing who they are and what they do. Femi, can I ask you to go first?
Absolutely. So my name is Femi Bibi. I'm a Principal Policy and Project Officer at London Councils. For those that don't know, London Councils is an organisation that represents the collective voice of London's 32 local authorities plus the City of London. We work on policy issues that are of importance to London, like electric vehicle infrastructure. We provide services such as the London taxi cards. We promote collaboration between local authorities and engagement with central government. And on EVs specifically, I hold the pen. for the Transport and Environment team within London Councils. And yeah, I work very closely with borough officers to support them in delivering as much EV infrastructure as they possibly can.
Thanks, Femi. Great to have you here. Now, if I could go to Daniel.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name's Daniel Gosby, and I'm the Low Emission Transport Officer at the London Borough of Waltham Forest. For those of you that are not familiar with Waltham Forest, we are in the northeast of London, and we have around 275,000 residents. Our remit covers the areas of Chingford, Hymes Park, Walthamstow, Leighton, and Leytonstone. I've been leading on our rollout of public electric vehicle charging point infrastructure and our strategy for the past 5 years. We've currently got a network of 575 sockets, and we've got plans in place to increase this to 1,000 by the end of this financial year.
Thank you, Daniel. And now, if I could go to Mark.
Hi, good morning. I'm Mark Cooper. I'm the Technical Business Development Manager for Ubitricity here in the UK, which means I provide all of the kind of technical support, not only to our sales teams when they're coming and talking to local authorities and our end users and everything with regard to DNO connections, the hardware that we use, the solutions that we provide, etc. But I also work very closely with our operations teams, and helping those out when they come across any technical challenges, and equally our product development team based over in Berlin, where we're looking at the next generation of chargers and hardware that we might be looking to provide.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. So, 3 fantastic panelists. And, just quickly, if none of you have heard of Ubitricity, we are the largest CPO in the UK by number of chargers. We're well known for our lamppost chargers. We also do fast and rapid chargers. But really, we are focused on how do we work most effectively with local authorities, and how do we help local authorities to achieve their electrification aims. And that's why, we're passionate about this topic of the decisions you make about what type of chargers and where you put them. So what we'll do is we'll take each of these themes separately, and we'll hear from the panelists. We'll start with right charger, and then we'll go to the location, right place, and then the timing, the right time theme. So we roughly divide it up like that. But maybe first of all, it would be great to hear or see what all of the audience is thinking. So if we could have the first poll, which should come up on the screen soon, then if you could just give your thoughts on that, which is really a ranking of, and let me see, which is really, as you can see, a ranking of, if you look out to 2030, what do you think the mix is going to be? So do you think it's going to be sort of the majority are going to be rapid chargers, so plus 50 kilowatts, and then the rest of the chargers are going to be some fast and some standard? Or do you think that fast 7 to 22 is going to dominate? Or do you think that standard 4 to 7 kilowatt is going to dominate in terms of number of chargers? Or you can say you don't know. So just great to get your thoughts on that. We'll leave the poll running. And we've used this new terminology, which would be introduced by the Levi technical specifications. So the new OZEB, or Government Levi Fund, which has introduced the naming of standard for around that 4 to 7 kilowatt speed. All right, as we leave that poll running, so maybe first of all, I'll go to you, Daniel, with a question. I think sometimes when we think about the right charger, so what is the right hardware and often this question is, what's the right speed of charging? We do sometimes see people kind of going for one solution. That might be just the slower chargers or just the rapid chargers. But I would like to ask you, in your opinion, do you think there's one charger can meet all of our demands, or how do you think about this mix and this choice?
In my opinion, there's definitely not a one charger that fits all approach to electric vehicle charging points. There is a range of charging devices out there for a reason, and I think it's really key for local authorities to listen to the needs of EV users and potential EV users for what's going to help them charge their vehicles. Or if they haven't got a vehicle yet, they're still using petrol, diesel. Why am I going to make the switch? Why am I going to invest money and time in having an electric vehicle? And having a mixture of the charging points that are available from the standard to the fast to the rapids will help residents and EV users charge for their different charging needs. The majority of the time, vehicles are parked. Therefore, the overnight standard charger, that Ubitricity have in the lamp columns makes perfect sense for residential areas. I know I'm going on to the right place there a little bit, so I'll bring it back to the right charger. But they are definitely really important. And when we listen to residents' requests, we have a application form, so anyone who lives in the borough or has a business in the borough can request a public charge point through that process. EV users generally do want to have overnight chargers in their residential area. Businesses tend to say, I have an overturn of vehicles coming through and out of the day. I might need a faster or rapid charger. And then in town centres, so I mentioned them in the introduction, we've got Chingford, Walthamstow, Hymes Park Lane, Leytonstone. In those areas where we've got the high streets, we've got lots of visitors coming into the area, a rapid charger might make a bit more sense. So I definitely think across, and local authorities, we know our areas better than anybody. Each local authority is so different, especially in London. There's 32 different local authorities. They all look and feel different across the whole country. You can have rural local authorities where you might need a different type of charger. There's less demand for on-street parking. Therefore, it all changes. But you shouldn't be looking at your EV strategy going, I'm going to go out to procure one type of charging device, and that's going to be standard across the whole area.
So it sounds really like Daniel, you're sort of advocating getting inside the minds of the different EV drivers and their real needs, rather than thinking of this as some sort of abstract or theoretical planning.
Yeah, I definitely would recommend that you engage with your residents and have a database of where residents want charge points and what type as well.
Yeah. Okay, great. Femi, maybe if I go to you now, because you, I suppose, you have been in your role grappling with a hugely complex task of looking across London boroughs as well, and thinking through the infrastructure needed and how that can happen with, I suppose, London being such a densely populated city, transport critical to it, air quality issues. It's not a nice to have. It's really critical. But when you think of London, and I suppose this can apply to other urban centres, what do you think of the ideal mix of charge points? How do you think about that for the future?
So I would start just by reinforcing basically everything that Daniel just said. It is really important to understand the needs of local residents, the wants of local residents, and it's also very important not to consider EV infrastructure provision in an abstract sense. It's really important to get into the details. In terms of London, looking at London as a whole, I can't say that there is a specific type of charge point that would, meet demands. It is really important to consider that each borough, even within each borough, apologies, there are different EV user groups with different needs, and thus, it's really important to take a place-based approach when considering EV infrastructure charging. EV infrastructure delivery. And a really key element in enabling this is by utilizing good data, good modeling, good forecasting. And, we've been very fortunate in London. We have bodies like TfL that have conducted a lot of kind of data and research and produced very good modeling data. More broadly, there is there was modelling that was done out to 2030 by the ICCT, the International Coalition on Clean Transport, that provided boroughs in London with really good insights into potential future infrastructure needs and potentially where. But through Levi, we've also got access to a really useful tool, the Nevis Insight tool, which is provided by Cenex, which is part of the OZEV support body. So it's really important in large urban areas to definitely take a place-based approach, but also for that place-based approach to be data-driven, and kind of to be far-looking, because for a very long time in London, we've been very reactionary, kind of, as Dan said, responding to resident requests. And as the number of EV user groups continues to grow, I mean, like in London, we've seen year on year borderline exponential growth, give or take in the 10,000s on pretty much an annual basis. There's going to be a greater need to kind of have a further view on the types of charge points that will be needed to meet the different types of user groups. And then that will dictate really where and when. That will really dictate the types of charge points and where best they can be placed. So data.
Okay, great. Yeah, and it sounds like you've got quite rich sources of data, and you mentioned the Cenex tool, which I know is available to local authorities. So I don't know exactly how many are using that, but obviously that is a really good source of data and insights. Well, Mark, maybe if I can go to you then. I think sometimes I think we see in our discussions with local authorities that obviously everybody's asking for or searching for the right answer, as in what's the precise ratio or mix of standard to rapid to fast chargers. Is there a magical mix that can be applied? But yeah, what do you think about that? How do you think about the ratio and the mix of different charging hardware and types?
I think if there was a magical number for this ratio, then we'd all be out of a job, because it'd be fairly easy. There isn't one, unfortunately. There is no magical mix. There's certainly not a hard and fast number of what these charge point hardware should be. I think, like everyone has said, Daniel and Femi have said, it's really, you need to use the data that's around you, understanding the dwell times for the areas that you're looking at. So if we looked at car parks, for example, there's a really big difference in the time that people have their cars parked in a park and ride solution or a train station, where the car might be there for 5-6 hours, compared to a leisure centre, where the car might be there for 40 minutes or an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, where it's parked up. So the speed of the charger needs to be different. It can be exactly the same for a workplace. We mentioned earlier on about offices and workplaces. You might want to provide a more standard speed for your employees, so that they can plug in, be there for 5 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, plugged in during the day, and just using standard speed for that. Whereas perhaps delivery drivers or visitors that might only be there for 2 hours might need a quick top up. So you might want to put a fast or rapid in for them. So there is no magical mix. It's really based on the data. But the data is not the only solution. We really need to sit and talk with the borough officers, with the council officers, and understand their needs, their vision for their cities, their places, and what they're seeing from their residents, and understanding how all of this fits in with their whole transport vision and strategic view for the local authority. So data can give you a baseline, but you need to finesse that with discussions, with the understanding the needs of the residents, understanding the vision that the local authority has for their area.
Yeah, and like you say, it's even, even if you take one type of location and you're thinking, right, what hardware goes into that? I remember a situation where we were putting chargers into a supermarket car park. And we knew that the dwell time was around 45 minutes average, but we thought, well, there are going to be some longer dwell times, some less. So we put in both 7 to 22 kilowatt chargers and some 50 kilowatt rapid chargers. In that particular type of supermarket, most of those settings, we saw that the rapid chargers were more used because a lot of people were shopping at that one shop, 30 to 45 minutes. 50 kilowatt speed gives you a good fill, a good battery recharge time. But if you'd put those 50 kilowatts maybe in a big retail center like Blue Water or something, where the dwell time is much bigger, you'd be wasting that costly infrastructure. And like you said, a park and ride, it would even be worse. So even thinking of one type of location, call it car park, it's going to be lots of difference. And I think we also got to accept that we've got to learn from experience, haven't we, once we put these in, to find out what's happening and then adjust.
Absolutely, adjust it over time. But equally, I think even in a park and ride, you can't say they're all going to be there for 6 hours. So it's still going to need a mix of hardware in that location, because there may be somebody that's just parked there nipping into the city centre for an hour and a half for a meeting and then coming back. So there is no magic number. I wish it was a one size fits all solution, but it doesn't exist.
Yeah. And Daniel, maybe I can ask a specific question as well to you, because we've seen in quite a lot of the tenders coming out for residential on street that people might specify a certain speed of charging. For example, could be 7 to 22, which wouldn't be suitable for lamppost charging, which Ubitricity and other companies provide chargers for, which is more, around 5 kilowatts. So did you, because you've installed lamppost chargers in your borough, did you ever sort of scratch your head and wonder, oh, are these going to be fast enough? Will I have a problem with speed? And how has that worked out for you?
I think we've realised early on in designing our network of charge points that there has to be that mixture, and we realised that, I said it before, but resident vehicles are parked in residential areas overnight. Therefore, the 5 kilowatt charge points makes a lot of sense. And by installing charging points into lamp columns, existing lamp columns, we're really cutting down on street clutter. And we've recognized that ultimately we are putting in electric vehicle charge points for the benefit of car drivers, a specific user group who use the roads and the public highway. And we want to try and minimize the impact that this infrastructure will have on pedestrians and other road users. So lamp column charging and the slower standard 5 kilowatt charge point is a huge part of our strategy. And our strategy looks into the right charger in the right place, and looks at the different types of devices that are out there on the market. So we've recognized that every controlled parking zone in the borough, and we've got over 80, should have lamp column charging points to support residents without access to off-street parking to charge their vehicles overnight. We then recognized that we need to install some of the faster chargers. So he's mentioning the 7 kilowatts or 22 kilowatts at a strategic level across the borough. And we've identified that 80% of residents should be within a 400-meter walk of a charge point. We decided 400 meters to keep in line with TfL's definition of what a resident should walk to a bus stop, just for comparison. And the reason we've said 80%, not 100%, is because not every part of Waltham Forest is the same. It does look and feel different. So some of our residents, particularly in the north towards Essex, have access to off-street parking. Therefore, if they wanted to convert to electric, they might have the opportunity to have a charge point at home. installed on their driveway or in their garage. Therefore, if we're using public infrastructure, we might want to prioritize other parts of the borough. So that's where the 80% comes. And then moving on to the rapid charges, we have a different strategy for them, which really focuses on where we know that vehicles come for shorter dwell times and where residents and EV users do need to have that top-up charge or a quicker charge.
Yeah, I really like the way you've thought carefully about the 400 meters and the 80% of residents being within the 400 meters. I think, and comparing that to the walk to the bus stop, I think that's a really good analogy to, and that really then sets the framework for your network planning.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And yeah, so I think, if I could make like a suggestion or a request, is when you're thinking especially about on-street residential charging, is to think about not blocking out some of the solutions, like the slower lamppost charges. So I would say, if you want the best value for money, if you want to see the widest range of options for your on-street charging, don't specify a minimum of 7 kilowatt speeds, because you might be surprised at the cost efficiency and the low level of disruption and the speed at which you can convert existing street infrastructure like lampposts into chargers. There are huge positives, and I don't think you want to miss out on those. But let's have a look at the poll, because I find this really interesting. So I think all of the audience can see this, but the majority of people, so 33% have said, and this is for the mix of public chargers by 2030, that 50% of those chargers, or more than 50%, would be rapid, and the rest fast and standard. So that's the majority. The majority of people think that the majority of chargers in 2030 will be rapid. And then there's a split, like around 25% think there'll be more fast chargers than any other chargers, and another 25% think there'd be more standard chargers. And then there's a few very honest people in the I don't know, 13% in the I don't know. But I mean, any reactions to that? Because I find that pretty interesting, because that would mean, the implication of that is, if you've got, let's say, 300,000, I think the lower end of the UK government strategy forecast is around 300,000. It's actually a bit more, but let's say it's 300,000. That would mean 150,000 rapids, which is a massive number, and has all sorts of implications. Anybody want to, maybe we go to Mark or Femi? Either of you want to react to the poll?
Yeah, so I will quickly. I think obviously as EV drivers, most of us ourselves, you understand that generally you kind of charge when you're stopped. So the vehicle overnight, if it's parked outside your house on your driveway, you use your home charger and you charge it, and you're probably not going to need to charge for the next 2 or 3 days, because most people just don't do that kind of sort of mileage. When you're on the go, you charge when you stop. So if you're on the motorway network, you pull in to one to the loo or grab a coffee or something to eat or whatever, plug it in and charge it. You get a rapid charge, and that's the way. So I think having rapid chargers in our local communities very quickly is going to cost of the infrastructure is going to be a lot higher, for one thing, but equally I think the utilization is not going to be there, because if you're nipping into town to do an hour's shopping, after 20 minutes you're going to have to come back to the car and unplug it and move it, because you topped up your car. It doesn't really make a lot of sense for the dwell time that's going to be there, and there's going to be a lot of kind of blocked bays and overstay charges and things like that, and the cost of this infrastructure is not cheap.
And maybe if we compare it to ZapMap now, I think 52% of chargers at the moment, so there are around 48,000 public chargers. 52% are fast, 30% are slow, 18% are rapid or ultra rapid. Doesn't mean that that's the right mix, but it's interesting. I think there is sometimes an issue that we kind of assume that the charging infrastructure should be like the current refueling infrastructure, and that you should go somewhere and refuel. But yeah, Mark, like you said, and Daniel, like you said, it's actually about where the car is for the longest period of time is often where the majority of the charging is most convenient. And if you're lucky enough to have a driveway, you can have your own home charger. But we know for many cities, lots of people park on the street, myself included. I park on the street, therefore I rely on a public charging network and know the most convenient places as close as I can get it to my home. Like Daniel said, preferably within a few 100 meters walk. But Femi, like, what are your reactions to the poll? Because that would mean for London, if you were going to deploy 50 of all of the public charges in London, if 50% of them were rapid, what are the, is that possible? What are the implications of that?
So, I mean, it would be. I mean, I would agree that one, the cost of providing 50% rapid infrastructure would be most likely well outside the scope of many local authorities, if not all local authorities. And then again, the value add over, kind of a slow to fast, a standard or even a fast charger, just wouldn't be there. It doesn't. I mean, it comes back again to kind of having that understanding of individual user group needs. So, as has been said, rapid chargers are really for when you're on the go and you need a quick top up. And for just about everything else, a standard or even a slow charger can more than suffice. And particularly in those residential areas where people either have access to lamp column chargers or to their own home charging. And on the point of home charging, particularly in areas that lack a lot of off-street parking, there are a lot of kind of technologies that are rising and really interesting, such as gullies, which could be provided by local authorities, which would allow residents to lead a cable from their home to the curbside. So there are a lot of means by which slow to fast infrastructure can and does meet the needs of their targeted user groups. But it is interesting to see that so many people favor broader rapid deployment over slow to fast, because obviously there is the, I guess, perception that slow to fast infrastructure would lead to greater throughput, which would lead to more people being able to charge, which would potentially incentivize more people to transition to EV. But I think there just needs to be more communication of kind of how EV infrastructure interplays with each other and meets the needs of targeted user groups.
Great. Thanks, Femi. So maybe if we can move on to the next area of discussion, so right place. So this is where we locate the chargers. And if we can pull up the poll for that one, the second poll, which is asking about the planning tools you use. So for you, everybody listening to this, I'm sure many of you, especially in the local authorities, have either used a consultant, a mapping software. There are, or you could use resident requests. There's many or different sources of data, but really interested to see primarily which one are you most likely to use, and we'll get to the results later. But maybe first of all, maybe go to yourself, Daniel, because I think you've used resident requests quite a lot in your planning. I'm just really interested to hear your experience on why you thought residents' requests were a really good way to plan, and how you went about this, and if there's any advice you can give to the audience to help them.
Yeah, I think firstly, 5 years ago, when we first bought our very first batch of 65 charge points to go into lamp columns, we weren't sure where to put them. And I'm sure there's local authorities out there that start their journey, which will be in a very similar situation, and feelings familiar with that. So we decided we need to know where current EV drivers are based so that we can support them because they've made the investment, the early adopters, to have an electric vehicle. But we also want to know where are the residents that are thinking about having an electric vehicle because, you know, the old saying, very chicken and egg, is definitely appropriate to EV charging because you're not going to make the switch to an electric vehicle if you can't charge it at home or near home. I think that's the key thing for a lot of urban areas where residents do not have their own driveway. They need to be charging at close to home as possible, not a petrol station down the road or a council car park. It does need to be somewhere at home. So that's where the residents' request form came from. We wanted to reach out to our residents to understand what their needs are. And it was a successful way of identifying sites for that first batch of 65. And as we've grown, we've had more and more requests. We're now up to 2,000 requests, but we've only got, as I said at the start, 575 charge points. So you can do the maths there. We've got more demand than we have supply for electric vehicle charge points. So it is on us as the local authority to be supporting EV users in the borough and potential EV users. There's definitely mapping tools and visualization tools out there that we have used. Femi's mentioned the Nevis tool. That's part of Levi. That's something that we're really looking at because that can pull in data sets that we don't have access to as a local authority, to further analyze the right place for the charge points. We haven't used consultants in Waltham Forest. It has been highways officers ourselves and planning officers looking at the tools that we've got and our local knowledge to be able to come up with our strategy and therefore the network. But moving forwards, we are using some advice from EV charge point operators. I said at the start there, but 5 years ago, there were not many charge points in the UK. Now there's operators such as Ubitricity with 7,000 sockets. So they've got wealth of knowledge and experience of their existing network and what's happening elsewhere across the country and in similar locations that we can now tap into. So if I was answering this question, if I was in the audience, I'd be selecting residents' requests, mapping tools, and EV charge point operators' advice.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And Mark, what do you like when you think about, do you think of one source of advice or data? How would you advise or recommend people go about this big question of where to put chargers?
I think it's very much a combination of pretty much all of these. It's using the data you've already got, the data sets, the data analytics that may already exist within the council. So using those, mapping those data sets onto a visualization tool, because it's so much easier to look at a map of your area and understand your area than it is to look at numbers on a spreadsheet. That's very difficult to do. It's using residents' requests and mapping those out. So don't just accept a form. Don't get them to fill in a form as a request, but then take that data and map it so that you can see where your existing charge points are, where the residents' requests are, where the data says we've got growing EV ownership or anything like that. The Nevis tool, Cenex have announced today, I believe, that they've just joined up with ZapMap so that they can bring in all of the data from ZapMap as well, which shows all the existing charge points. So in your area, you're going to be able to see all the existing charge points from all the operators that use ZapMap, which is pretty much everybody. And you'll be able to start to visualize them on a mapping tool and see where are those areas where we've got an abundance of chargers and what type of chargers they are. And where are the areas that we really need to focus on and try and improve because we're seeing a demand from residents' requests or whatever. That data can come from a CPO, it comes from various sources, it can come from consultants, but I think using all of these tools, combining them all together and then, most importantly, using the local authorities' local knowledge to really understand how that fits with their strategy and what their residents are requesting.
Thanks, Mark. And I would, to build on that, I would say one of the things, I think it's easy to fall into the trap of, hunting out that software that's going to spit out the perfect solution for your area or your local authority, what to put where. I don't think that really exists. Like you say, it's about building up a puzzle with different inputs, and any kind of, sort of fancy algorithm that you think is going to do the job for you. Actually, you really, it's important to understand it and really understand how the network planning is built up yourself. And the other point is, one thing that we're really focused on at Ubitricity is we want to avoid network build-up in only certain types of places. So if you end up with a network where all of the charges are focused only on, let's say, the more affluent areas of a borough or a local authority, you're really skewing the potential EV transition. So I think, many people in the industry talk about an equitable approach to the EV transition. And if we're going to have that equitable approach and allow a broader scope of people as possible to move to EVs in a convenient way, we've got to be aware of that. That's another important part of network planning. And I suppose one other area, Femi, it'd be great to get your thoughts on is we've talked about sort of where to put it in terms of where it's going to be most used, where's the most appropriate place, but there's also the infrastructure angle, which I think you must have grappled with in London, and that's grid capacity. So how do you think about grid capacity, and how do you go about either assessing or ensuring that there is actually enough grid capacity for what you would like to see in a certain area in terms of EV infrastructure? Oh, I think you're on mute, Femi. Oh, yeah, you're back.
I'm back.
Yeah.
And I should be on. So sorry about that. You're definitely right. We have, it's kind of a perennial question, managing the challenge that is the grid, given that, the number of charge points in London, I believe since 2016 has grown by close to 2,000%. It is a challenge that we have been looking at, and fortunately, again, it comes down to the data that we have access to that can support boroughs in that planning regarding where to place their data. So through TfL, we have access again to very good modeling data. We ourselves, in partnership with an organization called LOTI, the London Office for Technology and Innovation, have produced an EV infrastructure data dashboard that provides really good insights to London borough officers, showing the location of charge points, showing utilization rates of charge points, providing really useful analytic information. But it also provides information around grid capacity, providing heat mapping. And these are all really useful tools that borough officers can take so that they can better understand where, if perhaps they're forecasting where infrastructure needs to go, they can be aware of potential challenges that might exist relating to the grid, or if a resident requests requests a charge point, the borough officers know that there could perhaps be challenges. But another kind of, I guess, fundamental thing that we've certainly been advising in London and looking to support borough officers in doing so is engaging with DNOs at earlier point as possible in EV infrastructure projects, because particularly with Levi, DNOs are going to be under a tremendous amount of pressure to deliver a lot of infrastructure, and where there's going to be the need for grid upgrades, it's much better to engage with DNOs at an earlier point as possible. I think primarily just to avoid being stuck in a very long queue, but also to have that understanding as to where the upgrades can and can't be made. So yeah, in terms of how we've addressed things in London, really data driven again, but also looking to engage with looking to engage with the DNOs at an earlier point as possible.
Yeah, so DNOs, being the critical partners in this. Yeah, that's a really good point. And if we look at the poll, it's pretty in line, I think, Daniel, with what you were saying. So mapping tools and visualization tools coming number one, but then residents' requests quite close behind that, and after that, data analytics. But quite a broad mix across them. So sounds in line with your type of thinking. Now, I'll move on to the next topic, which is right time, even though we're actually running out of time on this webinar. But the next one is right time. This is about the when you're making a decision to implement certain types of infrastructure. What is the right speed of delivery or pace of delivery? And Daniel, maybe I start with you because Waltham Forest pretty early mover, I think, in terms of EV infrastructure. I think you sort of pioneered, and you're one of the early boroughs to actually implement, and you're still implementing now. But what were the main factors in how you chose? When was the right time? And sort of another point to build on that is we do see quite a lot of local authorities waiting for certain funding to come through. You actually moved ahead and found ways maybe not to be just in line with funding, but seeing what solutions there are. So what is your thought on the pace of delivery?
I think to answer the question of the right time as to why we made the decision to be an early leader in this comes from 2019 when we declared a climate emergency. So we recognised that there is a climate emergency happening in Waltham Forest, and transport is a major factor in the amount of emissions in the borough. Therefore, we need to do something about this. And this factors into a range of transport strategy, including walking, cycling, some of our mini Holland infrastructure that we installed, and how electric vehicles can support car drivers and car owners in the borough to clean up their vehicle. So from 2019, we created this strategy, which we've been delivering and reviewing on an annual basis. In terms of funding, we've used a range of funding sources. So the on-street resident charge point scheme from the Department for Transport, we've utilised 3 projects through that. We also had the Go Ultra Low City scheme, which London Council's led on, which I think ended just before the pandemic, but we were able to receive funding through that. And we've also been able to use Section 106 money to top up the rest. But the source of funding's changed massively over the last couple of years. There's now private investment from the public sector, for private sector. Sorry, so there's charge point operators out there who have the ability to support local authorities with scaling up the amount of charging points in the areas. And like we discussed, there is Levi, which is going to be an opportunity for local authorities across the borough, across the country to scale up the number of charge points at pace. So, yeah, I think in short, we just recognised quite early on that we need to do something about the wider climate and the role that transport plays in it.
Yeah, and I suppose, like you said, there's always options to move sooner rather than later, aren't there, for a local authority? So there are 2 phases of Levi funding. I think, if a local authority is in the second phase, they don't need to wait necessarily. They can still use that second phase of funding, but they if they want to, they can act now and go to the commercial sector, so operators like ourselves and others, and ask if there are fully funded options. Because I think, like you said, the need to lower emissions from transport, the need to improve air quality, especially in urban areas, is a need right. It's not future need; it's a need right now. So I don't think there's any reason to wait, but instead to use all of the different possibilities and mechanisms for funding. And I suppose another area, Femi, I don't know, whether you have a view or advice on this, but I think procurement is complex, isn't it? When it comes to thinking about how am I going to procure as a local authority, what framework am I going to use? Am I going to do a tender, or is there another way to do it? Or, and that can result in a long time period. But is there any advice you have on local authorities when they're thinking about how to procure EV charging? And maybe, whether that's linked to also partnerships, because Levi is encouraging partnerships between local authorities to procure. And you've had experience of London boroughs partnering.
Yeah, so I mean, you're very right. Procurement is a very long process and involves a lot of actors within a local authority. It is time consuming and can be quite a cost burden. In terms of, I suppose, advice and you could say learnings from London, a key thing that we've very much tried to encourage is boroughs and through Levi the partnerships to engage with the charge point operators or the charge point market at as early an opportunity as possible, because we have found that there are a lot of charge point operators who are willing to who are very keen actually to provide fully costed infrastructure in a lot of places in London. Apologies, I've had this terrible cough. But in terms of procurement itself, there are a lot of methods by which boroughs can, local authorities can undertake procurement through the Ultra Low City Scheme, for instance. We produced our own bespoke procurement framework for that scheme, which borough officers were very happy to use, and through it, we delivered over 4,200 charge points when our initial aim had been to deliver just 2,150. But there are a lot of very good charge point procurement frameworks available, such as the CCS, the Crown Commissioning Services, Vehicle Charging Infrastructure Solutions Dynamic Purchasing System, or the Oxford Dynamic Purchasing System. I guess the key thing really is engagement with procurement teams at as early an opportunity as possible. If you have dedicated procurement teams, to ensure that you don't end up with a backlog or a delay in the event that a local authority is already undergoing procurement for other services, etc. And this is going to be a particularly important point for Levi, given the scale of procurements that are likely going to take place through the partnerships. And on that, we really look forward to engaging with the charge point operator market to see what can be done.
Great. Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear your thoughts, Femi, because you've probably dealt with these and wrestled with these kind of issues, more than many of us. So fantastic insights. Now, I've only left 5 minutes for the questions, and that's my fault, but the conversation was really great with the panelists. What we're going to do now is rattle through quickly some of the questions. We won't get to them all, but we will commit to answering them and getting back to you anyway. So maybe if I can go first of all to you, Mark. So there's a question here about how are you managing highway regulations when installing into street lamps that are not on the edge of the road? So I suppose these are ones at the back of the pavement.
Yeah, so there are a number of solutions that are available. to kind of solve this issue, but the way we favour to do that is to actually install what we call a satellite bollard. So the feed from the street lighting column, we install a small cable underneath the footpath to a very discreet, very slimline bollard that's then installed at the front of the path. It's always mounted away from the column, so we're not directly in front of it. We're not creating pinch points or anything like that. We actually mount a kind of 45-degree angle from the column, maintain the footpath width all the way through, so we're not creating an obstruction. And then the bollard itself has the socket in it and the charge point hardware, and basically allows you to plug into the bollard the same way. And then obviously your Type 2 cable that's connected to your vehicle is kind of in the gutter of the road and everything, kept out of the footpath. One thing we don't want is trailing leads across the footpath. That's the one thing we are absolutely committed to avoiding.
And there's another question maybe that you can quickly cover off, which is just about what about the lamppost? Is there enough power for a 5 kilowatt charge?
Okay, so one of the big advantages, I've worked in street lighting for over 35 years, that's my background. And one of the big advantages we've seen because of the recent move to changing all of our street light lanterns to LED is that actually we've freed up a huge amount of energy within the grid. The latest figures from National Grid is actually their peak demand for energy supplies has kind of dropped by about 16% because of this switch over to LEDs. The cable that feeds the street light is exactly the same cable that feeds your house, which feeds the factory down the road, and everything like that. It's all teed off of the same mains cable. So if we're installing 7 kilowatt chargers on houses, then we can quite happily use the kind of 4 or 5 kilowatts out of a street lighting column with no adverse effect on the power supply and no real effect on the column at all.
Okay, maybe let's try and squeeze one more question in. Daniel, there's a question here on any insight into how to deal with the issue of blocking of charging in residential streets and the perceived ownership of the highway outside the home. I know this is it can be an issue that people get concerned about, but what's your experience in Waltham Forest?
We install more than one per request per road, so that increases the likelihood of a charging socket being available and also future-proofing the network at the same time. So we'd like to install 2 or 3 in a close proximity to each other. Not every request is going to have a lamp column directly outside their house anyway. So this is always going to be an issue that we're using existing lamp columns. So we have to use the infrastructure that we've got. But what we are doing is we're trialing installing EV only bays at lamp column charge points. So we've currently got 270 odd sockets in the borough. We're increasing that to 750 by the end of the year. So we're going to trial it at 50 of our existing sites. We've got years of background utilization data for those sockets. We're going to install the bays, see how residents react to that, and then also analyze, does that have an impact on the utilization? If it does, great, then we can probably roll it out. If not, then it probably says that residents themselves are utilizing neighborly communications and contacts to be able to access to the chargers when they need to. And ultimately, with everything we are doing with walking, cycling, public transport, I've seen it mentioned in the chat there, residents are not needing to charge every day anyway, particularly in London. A full charge for some users could be sufficient for a couple of weeks to a month. So access to chargers doesn't need to be a daily thing.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you, Daniel. Well, I think we're up against the clock. So I think what I'd like to do is just introduce one final poll, which is whether anyone in the audience would like to book a call with Ubitricity. You can just say yes or no. But if you say yes, we'd love to talk to you and understand your needs, especially if you're a local authority, and whether there's anything we can do to help you, on the whole electrification of transport in your area. So we'll leave that poll going. But really, I'd just like to say thank you very much to the panelists. So yeah, thank you so much, Femi, Daniel, and Mark. Great discussion. What we will do is follow up. We haven't got to a lot of the questions, so we'll follow up on that. But I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. We covered lots of topics. I think what I take out of it is there is no one answer, but really getting into the mind of the EV driver, getting into the needs of it, thinking about a broad spread of charging speeds, and really thinking deeply about the location that they go in. And then if you want to move ahead now, and if you want to, respond to the climate emergency in your area, there's always a way to do it. You don't have to wait. So there are procurement routes and there are funding routes, which means you can start now. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you. But yeah, mainly it's a big thanks for everyone attending, and thank you to the panelists.
Thanks, love.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Okay.